because actually nobody knows exactly what happened with the birth of Jesus. But we do know the Gospels, and because it was told, however and by whomever was capable of telling it, it changed the world. And in my heart of hearts, I knew that there was a story that humanity was going through that we hadn't yet told. And that if it would ever be told, just like in the gospel stories, then people could act on it. People could try to carry out the story, try to live the life of Jesus, try to become filled with what was in those gospels as our guidance. And when I got our story is a birth, go tell the story, Barbara, what really happened to me during that experience was it got imprinted on my cells that we, and all of us, are members of a planetary body. That's not a mystical revelation, that's an obvious thought. It's also completely true that Earth is a living system, and that Earth is in pain, and it's in crisis, and it's running out of energy. And when we saw, astronauts saw Earth from space, there was no people and there was no living system. It was a beautiful planet, but where were we? I actually saw an overview of the Earth as a living system. And I experienced myself and all of us as members of it. And I experienced the collective pain. And this is a great theory in evolution, that crisis precedes transformation. That problems are evolutionary drivers, and evolution only works out of stress. No stress, no evolution. So what happened was I got an experiential few frames ahead in the movie of what happens when we respond to the stress. We've been talking from a scientific point of view today. My friend Michel Poste from Paris, and you'll hear from later as a systems scientist, that the scientists' predictions are dire. This is not just that we're making up that there's a small problem, there's a huge problem. And I would like to say that I think it's a genuine revelation that when the intensity of the crisis is felt enough, it's almost enough now, because many of us it's already happening to. What happened in that experience and what's happening now is the heart opens up and empathy starts to grow. Now we have now the new nervous system of humanity that actually in Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, all of that is able to communicate our feelings. And these feelings are being communicated outside of the network of the mass media that has an infantile nervous system. It's infantile, and it responds to pain and puts us to sleep. However, we have a new nervous system just recently. Even since I had that experience in 1966, an enormous new nervous system has come up in the last few years, really. And so I began to experience what we're now calling a planetary birth, or birth 2012. Now, I want to go through the experience again and then tell you the miracle is that exactly the experience that motivated me since 1966 is precisely what Angel in Tucson and people all over the world are saying, let's do it. Let's see if we are capable of mass resonance to experience mass empathy, heart coherence, and connectivity with each other, linking innovations that work, just like in that little excerpt. And let's see if that is exactly the solution that can be done. With all the brilliance of the system scientists and all the brilliance of the innovators, if we don't have the field of mass resonance, connectivity, love, and what you might say is deeper impulse, of the spiritual impulse that has guided humanity for all the great faiths and religions and great beings. I believe we're right aiming at a mass mystical experience of co-creation. What do you think? Yeah. And so in this, just to go over the steps that I feel are the emergent potentials that are now happening, and that through Birth 2012 we have a chance of you might say, focalizing it. It's already happening. So the first is the awareness of the pain. And we've had a deep, intensive versions of this in many, many times. We may not yet, fortunately, have had the complete collapse through climate change of our environment. Because if we go complete collapse, then we're a failed civilization. And we have a huge difficulty of ever recreating it. So we haven't yet gone through that collapse, but it's imminent. So that's the crisis, that's the driver. The spread of empathy is obviously happening everywhere. Not only from the internet, but from also, in that case, the mass media. If there's a tsunami, if there's a hurricane, if there's a starving child, and it's right there in your face every day, every night. And so we are feeling with each other in ways that were never feasible before. Everywhere in the world. And then we all feel we need to do something about it. And there are all kinds of movements. Now we know it's not quite enough, but we're doing it. So the first was empathy. The second was the internalization of spirit. And we know new thought, old thought, evolutionary thought. I believe all thought that has ever been spiritually motivated has felt from within the spirit of the divine, the spirit in action, the consciousness force, the intention of creation, the Godhead, whatever you want to call it. All mystical experiences have accessed that and created the cultures. Cultures are named after the people who had these experiences, whether it be Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism or Taoism or Muslim. All of them founded over someone by this experience. It's really amazing. And then we've had all these monasteries and efforts and different churches, but never quite en masse. And the new thought is we're internalizing it. And when you internalize it, it feels internally like a deep calling, impulse, soul's code, yearning to fully express your love, your creativity, and being your full self. Has anybody felt that? Yes. That's it. That's the impulse. That's the incarnation of spirit. That's the core of the spiral. You see that diagram from the mind of God up through all the curve, universe, earth, life, animal life, human life. And we'll talk about the wheel in just a moment. That is a very, very symbolic impulse that comes from the actual silence, that comes from source, that comes from divine mystery. And that wonderful little moment of impulse between eternal and evolving is the mystery that Jean Gabser says it's an ever-present origin. Andrew Cohen calls it the inner Big Bang. And I kind of like that. The inner Big Bang is that force in each one of us. When we tune in, something starts to activate us to be an originator of the expression of this spiritual beingness that's in us. So I call that the incarnation of spirit. And I do want to, I don't know what the Southern Baptists and the Methodists and all will think of this, but I got a phrase during this experience which I call a planetary Pentecost. Now, if anybody remembers the story of the Pentecost, it founded the church. And in the very simplest way, what happened when, after Jesus' crucifixion, metamorphosis, resurrection, promise, and so forth. The disciples were very frightened. It was a terrible time, and they were gathered in, they call it the upper room. And the upper room was filled with people who spoke different languages. And apparently what happened at 9 a.m. in the morning, and the disciples were speaking, and the description in the New Testament, in Acts, is they felt like flames were coming through them, and they were waking up, and they began to speak. And somebody said, how come we understand them? Because they are Galileans, and we are all these different nationalities, but we're all hearing it in our own language. And this man said, Peter got it. The man said, well, we must be drunk. Which I thought was 9 a.m. in the morning, which gives you a little vignette into the lifestyle. Right? We're not, Peter got up and said, no, we're not drunk. This is what has been prophesied by the prophet Joel. Now, probably nobody remembers very well the prophet Joel. The prophet Joel said that in the last days the Lord will pour spirit on all flesh. And your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams. And Peter said, this must be what's happening. And what actually happened because of this collective incarnation of spirit is those disciples who had been completely afraid and powerless left with the powers of the natural Christ. They could heal, they could levitate, they could break the bonds of prison. They were completely animated by this power. And it is said that that was what the formation of the church began at the first Pentecost. When I experience enough of us getting this from within and feeling that spirit coming in with empathy, the words I heard, well, this is the planetary Pentecost. Because we're hearing it in our own language, and everybody was speaking in their own words. But it was the inner words of this one spirit. So I think this is already happening in many, many ways. As people gather together, we're not saying, I'm a Methodist, I'm a Christian, I'm a Jew. Something else is happening here. And it's coming through us as our own inner expression of the impulse of creation. And so that happened, and then the healings were natural because when you're in a resonant field of love, and spirit's coming through you, the healing powers are definitely turned on, and we already know that too. And it's already that the healing arts have grown enormously in the last few decades. And so then the last part of it was, first of all, the media began to have to pick up the good news. It healed the mass media because people were gathering everywhere experiencing things, and the media had to cover it. And so it began to be converted by a mass experience of the news of people gathering and experiencing. And then the last part was the Buckminster Fuller scenario. And I was a student of Buckminster Fuller, and he was one of my great teachers and inspirers, and he basically had a Christ experience himself. And this is a story he never tells, but I wrote a book on my experience of the evolutionary meaning of the life of Jesus, and I showed it to him. And he pulled me aside one day, and he said, darling, there's only God. There's nothing like God. And I had an experience like yours, where he had a Christ experience, Christ came to him, he felt he was lifted up, and he heard the words, you are a mini Christ on earth. What you attest to is true. And he said he went to the New Testament, and he wrote almost the same thing I wrote, which is basically Jesus was a forecast of evolutionary potential. And he said he hid it because as a cosmic engineer, he could not use the word Christ or God. But he said, you could get away with it. Because nobody cares what you're going to say. But ultimately, when I asked him for a comment on this book, which is published in part called Revelation, he said, Barbara is the best informed futurist now alive on the potential of the future and what it can bring. And the reason he said that is we both had a Christ experience that actually led us to experience the total evolution of our species that is inherent in the Christ story, particularly of the crucifixion, the 3 days in the tomb, the resurrection. They promise that we are gods, that we will all be changed. Nobody could believe it because it was premature to believe it. But if you are an evolutionary scientist intuitive, you see that the next stage of evolution is what was predicted there. And Bucky Fuller and I became the most amazing allies. And when he wrote that, of course, the World Future Society was stunned to hear that I was the best informed woman now alive on futurism. Because none of them had had a Christ experience. They didn't know. But when I had that planetary birth experience, that's what happened. And what I experienced, which we can experience when we look at that wheel, is that the organic functions of innovation now occurring everywhere, in health, education, economics, science and technology, relationship, justice. If you put together the innovations occurring in small ways in many projects everywhere, and imagine them being coordinated, like cells in a body are coordinated, which itself is an enormous miracle, that I experienced that what Buckminster Fuller said, that we have the resource, technology, and know-how to make this world work for all, is absolutely true. When we connect heart with heart and spirit with spirit in a resonant field. And so and at the final part of this, when the connectivity was made at a sufficient level of resonance, the mystic joy would be the only way to explain it. If you've ever had a mystical experience and there's a joy in your heart that really, it's a passive understanding. You can't say it's just because of that. But when that is shared by any group, it changes their life. And my planetary birth experience is that it happened on a planetary scale. And when it happened, there were enough people who knew how to take the next step of coordinating us at local levels, global levels, and certainly the innovations. And it changed the mindset of the planet Earth. Now, that was 1966. And here is the miracle. I won't go through my entire life story from 1966 to the present, but I was a wife and mother of 5 in Lakeville, Connecticut, told to go tell the story of the birth of humanity. And it was not popular with my husband or my children.